Chapter 56, Effects of Humans on the Environment. Today we're looking at global warming and ozone depletion. These are two distinct, different problems. So we're going to look first at global warming, and this is caused by excess greenhouse gases. And so the problem is that there's too much of them. And so carbon dioxide is one of the major greenhouse gases, and it's released by anything with a combustion engine, but cars are a big source. And so each of these individual cars releases carbon dioxide and increases the greenhouse effect. So here's how the greenhouse effect works. Sunlight reaches the earth. Some of that light is reflected. Some of that light is absorbed by the earth itself, right? The water and the land, and some is absorbed by the atmosphere. And so here's the greenhouse effect. You might have seen it in your car before. You might have experienced it in your car. But anyway, here's light coming into the greenhouse. And the light is absorbed and then it's released. And it's released as a lower frequency. So it can be released as infrared heat. And a lot of that is going to be trapped inside the greenhouse. And so the greenhouse heats up. And so you've probably seen this in your car before. You go to the beach or you go to the mall or whatever you're doing, and you leave the car out in the sun. And if you left the windows rolled up, you'll notice when you come back that the car is really hot. Sometimes any metal in the cars, even if you have an older car, it'll burn you. So the car gets much, much hotter because of the greenhouse effect. And that's the same thing that happens with our planet. So the light comes to the planet, and some of it is reflected back, right? And some of it is absorbed, and some of it is slowed down, and that is trapped by the atmosphere. And so that just bounces around and makes our planet nice and warm. And it can be good, right? So if we had no atmosphere, then that would be really bad for a whole bunch of reasons. One of them being that the planet would be, not warm enough for us. Okay, so the greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide. And the more carbon dioxide you have in the planet and the warmer it gets, actually the more water that you have in the atmosphere. So water is also a greenhouse gas. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, but it doesn't last for quite as long in the atmosphere. Nitrous oxide, N2O, or actually any nitrogen with oxygen. And then this is a little bit tricky. Ozone is a greenhouse gas when it's in a lower layer, but it's also a totally separate issue as well. So we'll talk about ozone later. So for now, we're just looking at these greenhouse gases. And so carbon dioxide is generally the main one that we look at. So on this axis, we've got carbon dioxide concentration in, again, parts per million. How much carbon dioxide do you have per million molecules? And so here's 1960. Up to 2010. And so the blue line is atmospheric carbon dioxide. And you can see that the carbon dioxide has been increasing over time. And here's the temperature in red. And so here's the average global temperature in Celsius. And although it fluctuates quite a bit, you can see the trend is overall very, very closely linked to carbon dioxide. So is the greenhouse effect good or bad? It's very, very good when it's in moderation. It's necessary for life, so it keeps our planet nice and warm. And it's bad when it gets to be too much. So if you have too much carbon dioxide, too much methane, the climate gets too warm, it tends to dry out the planet, and then you can't grow crops. And, if you don't have crops growing, it's kind of hard to feed people. Here's an example of one of the effects of global warming. So this red line is the Arctic ice boundary in 1979. So when I was 10 years old, this is the amount of ice that we had. And that had been pretty stable. And now you can see the amount of ice is much, much smaller. So since 1979, more than 20% of the polar ice cap has melted. Here's just a picture of ice calving. So it's ice in the Arctic breaking off and falling into the ocean. Global climate change will increase extreme weather events. So we've always gotten hurricanes, but we are getting more, and the hurricanes themselves are a higher category. So what happens is that there's more heat hitting the tropics, and that's adding more energy into these severe weather events, and we're getting more frequent and more destructive hurricanes. One of the biggest problems with global warming that we're going to see sooner rather than later is that it's going to dry out the planet, which means that we're going to have fewer places that can grow crops. Okay, so causes of greenhouse gases. So we've always had a baseline amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so I'm going to scoot ahead a little bit and show you that. So there are some natural ways that we get carbon dioxide. Volcanoes, fires, cellular respiration, these add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So if you look at all of these, the only way that carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere is photosynthesis. So here's photosynthesis on the land. Here is photosynthesis by phytoplankton in the ocean. But those are the only ways that we're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere becomes organic molecules. So that's stuff like sugar. And then anytime the plants do cellular respiration, or let's say an animal eats a plant and does cellular respiration, right? All of that is cellular respiration will add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Volcanoes add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Those are all baseline. Here's the problem: combustion of either wood or fossil fuels. So let's go backwards to look at that. So combustion of fossil fuels adds a lot of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So fossil fuels include materials like coal, oil, gasoline, and natural gas. So what are fossil fuels? How are they made? They are organic molecules. Organic molecules means they have at least one carbon, right? So these are molecules that came originally from sugar, right? And so these were in plants or in animals. So plants did photosynthesis. They took carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Animals ate them. Plants and animals die, and here they are. So they might just be decomposed and the carbon dioxide would be added back to the environment. But instead, in this case, they were trapped, right? And so they got trapped under rock. They got squished for millions of years. So this whole process is going to take millions of years. And then those trapped plants and animals become coal, oil, natural gas. Okay, so that's how they're made. They are, when you might think, okay, so we're burning fossil fuels, adding CO2 to the environment. Why don't we just let nature make more fossil fuels? Well, here's the thing. It takes millions of years to make fossil fuels, but to burn them only takes, dig them up, burn them. You can do that in a year, right? What else increases greenhouse gases? Deforestation. Increases the amount of CO2 because the carbon in the organic molecules that make up the plants is decomposed or burned, releasing CO2. So here's CO2 in the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide is taken up by photosynthesis. Naturally, a little bit of it would go back when the plants do cellular respiration or when they eventually die. But if you clear cut a whole area, you're increasing this part of the equation and getting rid of this part of the equation. So you're burning it all at once or decomposing it all at once and adding a whole lot of CO2 to the environment. And you're not taking any more CO2 out of the environment because the plants are dead, so they can't do photosynthesis anymore. Okay, another greenhouse gas is methane. Methane's a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, but it's not as long-lived. It happens whenever things go anaerobic. So that means no oxygen. So that can happen in the stomach of a cow because they have more than one stomach. And so they can make one of their stomachs anaerobic. And so cow farts essentially make methane. It can also happen when organic matter is decomposed underwater and it goes anaerobic. So actually bogs, peat moss burning peat moss or harvesting it is another way that methane's added to the environment. Another problem is that as the earth gets warmer, more methane is released from bogs. So there's lots of problems that start to kind of snowball. Another problem is that as the temperature increases, more evaporation happens. And so you add more water to the atmosphere, which in turn warms the atmosphere more. So a little bit scary when you start looking at this stuff. A lot of people think, well, if we are releasing more CO2 into the environment, no problem. Plants will just increase the amount of photosynthesis that they do. Here's one study that showed that that's not really true. So they took these little regions and enclosed them and increased the level of CO2 in them. And they wanted to see how much extra photosynthesis happened. And it turned out that they did increase their level of photosynthesis, but less than expected. And so the reason is that the availability of nitrogen and other elements like phosphorus decrease the amount of extra photosynthesis and extra carbon dioxide that could be taken out of the environment. So that's not really a solution. So some of the problems of global warming, one is that we're going to just heat up the planet to the degree that we might not be able to make enough food to support people because the planet's getting drier. Another is that a lot of species will get killed off because they are very specific and specialized to where they live. And so they have evolved to live in just one range of temperatures. And as the temperatures get hotter, they probably will not be able to withstand them, and it'll probably cause mass extinction. But what can we do about it? We can stop using fossil fuels so much, so we can decrease our energy consumption, and we can switch to sustainable energy like wind and water and solar. It would also be helpful if we reduce deforestation, because the forests are a nice sink for carbon dioxide. Okay, so now we're switching gears completely. Depletion of atmospheric ozone is a completely different problem. And so ozone can be a greenhouse gas, but it's also an important gas to have up higher in the atmosphere because it protects us from UV radiation. So life on the Earth is protected from the damaging effects of UV radiation by a protective layer of ozone molecules in the atmosphere. Here are satellite studies of the ozone layer. Here's the here's 1979 versus 2009, and you can see the ozone layer is thinning. And so ozone layer thickness from 1955 has decreased, but you can see it's starting to stabilize here. And that's because we passed laws that decreased chlorofluorocarbons, which are what kills the ozone layer. So here's what happens. Chlorofluorocarbons contain chlorine, and chlorine reacts with ozone. So here's chlorine with ozone. And so ozone is 3 oxygen atoms together. When they combine, the chlorine atom, remember chlorine's negative like that, it rips one of the oxygens off and leaves oxygen. And then you're left with more chlorine because sunlight will break this down, releasing oxygen. And then you have more chlorine to go through and do it again. So one chlorine atom can be super, super effective at destroying a lot of ozone. So this decreases ozone in the atmosphere. And ozone is this protective layer. I think I have a picture. Ozone is a protective layer that prevents ultraviolet light from getting to the planet. And the ultraviolet light can not only give you worse sunburns, but it can also damage your DNA. It can damage the DNA of phytoplankton, which is the basis of marine ecosystems, and really kill life. So it's the biggest problem. The ozone layer, the thinning of the ozone layer is the biggest problem in the Arctic, and it sometimes can swoop up over Australia and New Zealand and parts of South America. Ozone depletion causes DNA damage in plants and poor phytoplankton growth. So if you look at the wavelengths of light down here, ultraviolet light is, I think, around 380 and lower. The smaller the wavelengths, the more energy. So this stuff is more damaging than this stuff. And then we're getting to visible light over here. So the more energetic the light, the more likely that organisms are going to be killed. So these are calculations of inhibition of photosynthesis. So it's showing that the stronger the light, the more UV light you have, the more damaging it is for life.